Hello, my name's Jason. I'm not an archaeologist, but I do play one on TV. So come join me as we go into the dust.
This show has been brought to you by the letter H.
Okay, we are up to the letter H, and around here, H stands for historical archaeology. Now, when I say historical archaeology, I'm using a very basic and very inclusive definition, which essentially means archaeology in historic times, meaning written history. So, any archaeology done after prehistory when you have writing available. Now, this raises the obvious problem, which is that writing came about in different places at different times. And in fact, in many places, it came and went and came back again. Think Britain. The Iron Age population of Britain was not lettered. The Romans came in, they brought writing. Roman Britain has a lot of written sources. Then the Romans left in the 5th century, and once again, you then have a lack of writing, the Dark Ages. It survived in some pockets, but very, very little of it. In fact, I think from the first half of the 500s with Gildas, way up until 730 with Bede, there's no written source of any length from Britain. That's 200 years. And of course, writing did eventually return to Britain, as I know all too well, given the number of assignments. I learned about here is the process of archaeology. That would be historical archaeology, which is the process of doing archaeology aided by text, by writing, versus prehistoric archaeology, which is without writing. And just FYI, there are a lot of people who consider a different definition, a narrower definition of historical archaeology. They'll say something like archaeology of the colonial and post-colonial era, or everything Roman and thereafter. To me, that seems a little bit arbitrary and a little bit too Western-centric. The Roman Empire had nothing to do with China, for example. So I'm taking a more inclusive definition. And I know what you're probably thinking at this point, which is, historic sources, writing plus archaeology. What could be more powerful than that in getting a really full version of what happened in the past? And theoretically, I say, sure, but practically,
we've got issues.
You see, there is such a bias towards the written word, and though I'm a total history buff and I love reading, as Winston Churchill didn't actually say, history is written by the victors. And it's true anyway, even though he didn't actually say it. If you look at history, so much of it was written in a distorted way as to twist what really happened, demonize or erase certain people for the benefit of those in power. Think about Elizabeth I, someone who has been treated very well by history. She was the queen who presided over a golden age. She was Gloriana, the virgin queen.
Are you a virgin?
Wrong!
Actually, this is an orthodoxy Elizabeth herself established and ruthlessly enforced during her reign, aided, of course, by a network of spies and secret police, writers you may have heard of, and artists. Check out this charming family portrait of Elizabeth's family. In the center, you have her father, King Henry VIII. And to the left, that dark-looking woman in the background, well, that's her sister Mary, who preceded her on the throne. And right next to Mary is Mars, the god of war, the Roman god of war. So this presents Mary, who didn't get along with Elizabeth very well, as the past, as dark, as ushering in a period of war. And Elizabeth, on the other hand, on the right, resplendent in her white gown, is sort of a Virgin Mary-like figure, Gloriana embodied. And by the way, how do we know her sister Mary today? Bloody Mary. And do you think that's an accident? No. The victors are the ones who write the history. And, Elizabeth is an example of that. And I'm not going to get too deep into it because it's contentious and this is not a history channel, but there is a whole cottage industry nowadays of academic and professional historians who basically shit on Elizabeth quite a bit. I'll put some good links below in the show notes. Perhaps less pernicious, but far more commonplace, was simple bias. And we're going to stick to Britain because that's something that I happen to know very well, but you can find examples of this bias everywhere in history. So the first 500 years after the Roman Empire, pretty much all written history was coming from monks. These monks were increasingly associated with abbeys and monasteries that were under royal and noble patronage. So what did these guys care about? And what did they write about? They wrote about hairstyles, the date of Easter,
Easter bunny taken to the streets and getting into a fight.
what their royal sugar daddies were doing, what the frickin' geese were doing.
Wash this!
Among other important things. And what didn't they care so much about? The huge portion of society that was enslaved to some degree or another, the Welsh, women. You get the picture. So categories of people like these latter groups don't feature very large in history, and when they do, it's often not in a very positive light. So not surprisingly, in archaeology, there have been subfields that have sprung up around these very areas. For example, the archaeology of enslavement. This is a recent and very positive development that you can see happening all over the southeastern United States at plantations, where the focus is much more on the people who are doing all the work and feeding everyone than their wealthy masters. Or indigenous archaeology. Archaeologies of colonized people and minority people all over the world, and also feminist archaeology, which is now an established subdiscipline within archaeology in departments all over the world. And if you think this doesn't apply to modern times with its high rates of literacy and multiple forms of media, think again. The next time you're in New York City, I'd highly recommend you visit the New York City Tenement Museum on the Lower East Side, which details the lives of poor immigrants in this neighborhood. No, long before her. We're talking about the late 19th century and early 20th century. And what happened was when this building became vacant, they opened up the walls, and we learned really a lot about the daily lives and minutiae of generations of these immigrants. Now, I know what you're thinking. I know about the tenements in New York and the poor immigrants that passed through there. I read about that in my history book. And to that I would say, do we really? I mean, how much of that history book was written by them? Second, even if we have a bunch of their writings, did they really focus that much on their daily lives? Probably not. Just like those medieval monks, most people tend to write about things they think are important, their aspirations, their hopes and their dreams, not necessarily their everyday humdrum doings. And third and finally, the written word is certainly a powerful medium, but it doesn't give you the whole story. Experiencing something by seeing it and touching it, which is what you get with archaeology, brings it to a whole different level of understanding. And seeing that angle actually helps you to humanize someone, people who are distant in space and time. And that, I continue to maintain, is one of archaeology's core strengths and sort of its secret superpower. Because after all, that's right, Madonna, you got it right this time. So what are the takeaways from this? In fact, history and archaeology can play very well together and really be a 1 + 1 = 3 situation if we use it properly to aid our interpretations. But we have to check history for its biases and omissions and not let it predetermine our interpretations too much. We have to remember that
just because it's in print doesn't mean it's the gospel.
Why, thanks, Michael. Wow, we're getting a lot of wisdom from 1980s pop stars today. But anyway, the point is this. If we accept history as basically the truth and allow that to shape our archaeology research agendas, we're going to miss out on whole storylines and groups of people. We may even be misdirected by deliberate lies and obfuscations. And at very least, we're going to lose some of the power we could otherwise get from all of the sensory experiences that archaeology provides off of the page. A good example of how this can be done well, and also the pitfalls of historical archaeology, see my site visit to Masada. From there, we can see that even the Bible can be a good companion to archaeology if used with a skeptical eye and without an ideological agenda. A good lesson from this is that if we subordinate archaeology to history or let history totally guide archaeology, we're going to wind up with mistakes, omissions, and biases. History and archaeology are kind of like dancing partners, and if done right, it can be a beautiful thing. All right, so for today's site visit, I'm actually going to do something I didn't want to do, but it will make sense, so hear me out. Now, with these site visits, my intention is to show you a diversity of places all around the world, and I can do that because I've been to quite a few places. But today, we're actually going to stay in Greece, just like last episode. So why are we doing that? Well, with the last episode, the site visit and the archaeology porn, I think we're really in the headspace now. We talked all about the Bronze Age, Homer and the Iliad, and the archaeologists that literally uncovered this time in history, like Heinrich Schliemann, who we'll talk about more today, Arthur Evans, Carl Blegen. So rather than like going back later to Greece and then having to do a whole history refresher again, I'm going to do it now while we're all kind of still there. So sorry for the monotony, but I promise you it will be worth it. So today we are going to the archaeological site of ancient Mycenae. Now, just to quickly refresh your memory, Homer does talk about ancient Mycenae. This is the seat of the villainous king Agamemnon, as described by the Iliad's version of the Trojan War.
I'll carve Agamemnon in the stone. My name will last through the ages.
And recall that in the period just prior to the Mycenaean period, Minoan civilization on Crete had been the center of gravity in the Aegean. After that, the sort of power shifted over to the Mycenaean world, which was based in the southwestern part of mainland Greece in the Peloponnesian Peninsula. And it was a loosely structured society based on city-states and palaces, like, for example, Pylos, that's all the way in the southwestern corner of the Peloponnesian. And it was really during this period, about 1400 to 1200 BC, that what's known as the Greek world came together. You had the advent of Greek language and a more cohesive society on the mainland. Now, Mycenae seems to be at the pinnacle of the power structure there, which is why this was called the Mycenaean period. And it's in the northeastern part of the Peloponnesian Peninsula in an area called the Argolid. Now, the Argolid is essentially a archaeological theme park full of the greatest hits of both the Bronze Age and then the later Classical Age. You've got the site of ancient Olympia, where the Olympic Games came from. You've got Mistras, an amazing Byzantine site, Monemvasia, another amazing Byzantine site. Of course, Pylos, the other amazing Bronze Age palace. So that's in the Peloponnesian. But just in the Argolid, you have so many other sites too. You have Epidavros, the huge Roman-era theater and sort of rehab center. You've got Argos, a classical fortress. You have Tiryns, which is another Mycenaean-era palace. So there's quite a lot to see. But today we're going to focus on ancient Mycenae itself, which is really where the action was in that era. Just a 90-minute drive from Athens, it's not very difficult to get to ancient Mycenae, but you will need to rent a car or go on a coach tour from Athens because public transport is just not going to cut it. And as the site is on a hill, like most fortresses are, you're going to have to climb up. And I would also recommend, as a travel hack, if you're going to do archaeology in Greece, not go island hopping, go in the winter. It's going to be perfect outdoor weather for exercising, especially compared to more northern climes. And yeah, you're not going to go to the beach, but you won't regret it. The weather will be beautiful and you're going to beat the crowds. That said, I went in the morning, which again is another sort of hack of mine. But by the time we did leave, we did start seeing some crowds arrive. So I'd hate to see what it looks like during the summer. But in any event, this site does just get a fraction of the foot traffic that the Parthenon gets. So overall, it should be a bit of a more manageable visit compared to Athens, no matter when you go. So let's get to the modern history of the site, basically the excavations. Now, an important difference between Mycenae and the other sites we've talked about, like Knossos, is the site of Mycenae was already well known. Most of the major features, like, for example, the treasury of Atreus, which is actually just a giant tomb, the largest tholos or beehive tomb in the Greek world, well, they were already above ground and visible. So that means for a long time people knew where they were, and yeah, that means they were already well looted by the time anyone was doing some real excavations there. Now, in the 17th century, the Venetians, as in Venice, and at that point it was still an independent republic, was really in a hot contest with the Ottoman Empire for dominance in the Eastern Mediterranean. They were both naval powers. And at this time, the Argolid, where ancient Mycenae is, was under the control of the Venetians. So in 1700, the local Venetian governor had some debris cleared away from the site to make it more visitable. And it was those Venetians who first hypothesized that that Tholos tomb, not the treasury, was, the tomb of a Mycenaean king. I mean, why not? It was huge. So pretty good guess. It soon became even more of a tourist attraction in 1796, when Napoleon invaded and conquered a lot of Italy. And the reason for this was this part of Greece and ancient Mycenae had been a stop on the Grand Tour. Now, the Grand Tour was when young gentlemen in Europe, upper class, mostly British it's associated with, to get cultured, would tool around the Eastern Mediterranean. And they would do this to discover, ancient Rome, ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, which were considered the pinnacles of ancient civilization in that era. And along the way, they also collected or stole a bunch of stuff too. It's these young dandies who carved their names and a lot of other graffiti into ancient monuments all over the Mediterranean. In fact, at a place called the Temple of Poseidon, not far from Athens, you can find the carved signature of Lord Byron, the famous early 19th century British Romantic poet. So he left his mark behind too. And anyway, back to our story. So yeah, Napoleon, the French, and the Brits not cool with each other. So a lot of the Brits, rather than going on their grand tour to Italy, which was of course easier to get to from Britain than Greece was, they diverted away to avoid the French and started going more to Greece. And hence the site of ancient Mycenae started seeing more and more traffic. In the early 1800s, Lord Elgin, around the same time he was taking stuff at the Parthenon, dropped by ancient Mycenae. He did some investigations in the Tholos tomb, and he took away some pottery and stonework, which I presume is still somewhere in the British Museum. Now, at the same time, he tried to dislodge those carvings from the famous Lion's Gate, and couldn't get them off. I swear, these bags would steal anything that was not nailed down. And shortly after that, the local Ottoman governor, because remember, the Venetians and Ottomans were always fighting. Well, the Ottomans took this area and Athens from the Venetians, and they were in charge now. Well, the local Ottoman governor ordered some excavations in the Tholos tomb and supposedly found bones along with a bunch of gold, silver, and gems. And I don't even think we know what happened to that. But unfortunately, at this time, people wanted that treasure. They did not care about the bones, which I'm sure were summarily tossed away, as they always were at this time. And along with those bones went all of the information that we could have gotten from the site. And obviously, this Ottoman governor didn't care much for stonework either, because he had some stone pillars that were flanking the entrance to the Tholos tomb right outside of here, dislodged, and he sent them to a British noble as a gift. And those I know for sure are still in the British Museum, where you can see them today. Now, there wasn't much going on at the site in the decades after that. I think some French archaeologists did a survey. There was a little bit of maybe investigation and some cleanup work by Greek archaeologists. But again, mostly quiet until 1876, when enter Heinrich Schliemann. He had been a young dandy from Germany who had made a ton of money, enough to retire by the time he was a pretty young man. So with nothing better to do, he became an adventurer and an amateur archaeologist and became totally obsessed by the ancient Greek world. Schliemann at this point was perhaps one of the most famous men in the world, having just discovered ancient Troy a couple years earlier. And there, of course, he found tons of gold from what he called Priam's treasure that probably had nothing to do with Priam, and he smuggled it out of the country back to Germany. And that there in the photo is his wife sampling some of the jewels. Now, the Ottomans literally sued him for this, but I don't think they got much out of him, certainly not any of the treasure. And he was now in Greece, which at this point was an independent country, so he was safe. And in his day, even more so now, Schliemann was a controversial figure. He was quite a fabulist.
Oh, a bullshit artist.
Yeah, that too. So he became known for self-glorifying portrayals of his work, making up fibs here and there, and perhaps even planting artifacts in his digs to garner more press attention, though I do think history has largely exonerated him of this latter claim. However, he was known for his destructive archaeological tactics, which is even more important for us. He did real damage at the sites he investigated, especially ancient Troy, where ironically, he actually supposedly destroyed the lair of archaeology, which corresponded with the time of the Iliad and the Trojan War. So obviously, the record keeping and our knowledge of what he did at Mycenae is less than ideal, but he did have a successful dig. He found that famous circle of shaft graves, which were obviously overflowing with gold. So this one was a big hit too. The most stunning find was what Schliemann dubbed Agamemnon's mask, thinking that this solid gold mask could only be fit for a king. Another amazing find was one of those gold signet rings. And this one had a combat scene on it that would turn out to be nearly identical to the one found in 2015 in the tomb of the Griffin warrior. Now, we've already talked about this, but one of the amazing finds from that dig 150 years after this one was the combat agate. So Schliemann found a gold signet ring the scene of which nearly matched that on the combat agate. So pretty amazing. Now, Schliemann figured all of this belonged to Agamemnon because it was really fancy, but subsequent studies and investigations and excavations at the site have suggested that this layer of stratigraphy in this material was far earlier than Agamemnon would have been. And if you ask me, if he was such a great king, this Agamemnon, why not assign the Tholos tomb to him as opposed to just a shaft grave? But as all of the useful dating information was tossed away and, of course, since then lost or destroyed, we'll probably never know. The team also found what would later become known as the Silver Siege Rhyton, and a rhyton is sort of a kind of a drinking vessel. Now, this piece had an elaborate scene of an armed attack on a coastal settlement. Beyond its aesthetic quality, it really showed scholars kind of what warfare looked like back then, how the soldiers were dressed or not dressed. And though I think the dig here at Mycenae went a little better than the one at Troy in terms of not destroying quite as much, and it was rather thorough for an amateur in Schliemann's time. It was unimaginably destructive by today's standards. In fact, of the Troy excavation, American archaeologist and professor at Tulane University, Kenneth Harrell, quipped that Schliemann did what the ancient Greeks couldn't accomplish in their own time, which was to level the entire city walls of Troy down to the ground. Well, whatever you think of Schliemann, we can say at least one thing for him. He was prompt in publishing his results, which he did in 1878, just 2 years after the dig began. And that's a lot more than I can say for a lot of archaeologists today. I'm just saying. Okay, so let's talk about your visit. Just down the road a little ways from the modern parking lot, you'll find the Treasury of Atreus. Now, remember, that's really just the largest Tholos tomb in all of the Greek world, but the name Treasury, I guess, just stuck. Well, I wouldn't recommend going there first. I'd recommend seeing the site first and the museum and then coming back there. And it is cool to see because of the scale of it and the workmanship. However, there's not much inside. And that is something that's kind of a shame about the site. I mean, it's good that the gold actually did stay in Greek hands as opposed to the stuff from Troy, which, remember, was sent to Berlin and then stolen by the Soviets. But to see the riches from ancient Mycenae, you do need to go to the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. It's not on site. So you really need to proceed your visit to ancient Mycenae with a stop at that museum in Athens first, because that's really where the most impressive artifacts are kept. Now, I know why they might have done that. First of all, Athens is much more visited than here, so more people would see them in that sense. Secondly, with all of the museum heists going on in Europe, especially in Germany, I would imagine that those artifacts are safer in that big museum in Athens than they would be on this small on-site museum in the countryside. However, stripped away from their context from the site, those objects lose some of their power, their narrative quality, and their historic context. They're just kind of bling. And the site of ancient Mycenae itself loses some of its narrative power. Without the riches and all that wealth concentrated there for you to see, you kind of lose how important a center this was once upon a time, and therefore how important of a site it is. And it's also a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you remove the most bling artifacts to Athens, less people are going to visit the site, and they're going to continue to visit the Archaeological Museum in Athens, not here. So as you walk through the main entrance to the site, head directly to the left to the small on-site museum. Now, the museum does explain briefly some of like how it was excavated, where Mycenae sort of sits in history in relation to other periods of Greece. But to be honest, and this is coming from a real museum nerd, it's not a great museum. They do have some interesting panels, like one on trade, which explains thematically some of how Mycenae was important and what life there was like. But most of it, to be honest, was just pretty random. They had a panel about women, one about children, one about a blacksmith, focusing in on different parts of the site. But there really wasn't a cohesive story told. There was no multimedia, or the little bit there wasn't working. There was nothing interactive. So it just wasn't that exciting, and it sort of gave you a very disjointed views into the site. No overarching view and story told. And that's a shame because, like many marquee archaeological sites, ancient Mycenae is very complex. It really just is a big old palimpsest. Okay, you see the definition right there. I know that sounds like some kind of a weird sexual activity or something, but trust me, it's a very, very common archaeological term. But anyway, it's very complex. Without any kind of on-site video or multimedia display that really took you through the whole history, it just kind of gets lost. For example, when you ascend the summit of the fortress, you'll see the remains of an ancient Greek temple. And it doesn't really ever strike you that that's 1,000 years after the main action at Mycenae, which was during the Bronze Age. The sign never really alludes to that. And even for me, having studied this, it wasn't quite clear. I know at the center of these Bronze Age palaces, there was a throne room. And I don't think it even says it on site, but that was largely washed away and built over, which is why you see that temple. Now, the on-site interpretation with the signage is really not that great. It just kind of says, like, this is what you're looking at here, this is kind of what you're looking at there. There's no cohesive story. So as I always say, and broken record alert, splurge for a guide. You won't regret it. Anyway, after visiting the museum, which should take you no more than an hour, start climbing up the hill. You'll pass through the famous Lion's Gate, which is still very much intact. And as you do that, imagine yourself as a priest or a soldier or a slave. And you're looking at this for the first time and feeling that awe, knowing the palace is waiting for you at the top of the hill, which is where political, religious, whatever kind of power there was at this time resided. And on your way up to the top, you'll see some other ruins, some residential areas, some graves. You'll see the famous circle of shaft tombs that Schliemann found. So you'll notice all of that on the way up and take some time to take it all in. When you get to the top, you'll see the most prominent feature there, which is the ruins of that classical temple that I just alluded to a couple minutes ago. You'll see immediately why they plopped a big old fortress there once you see the commanding views of the surrounding countryside. Now, you'll go behind that classical Greek temple. You'll see a cistern, which is how they stored water up there, and go around the back to complete the circuit. Now, the whole thing, including a thorough walk around and look at the museum, should take you 3 hours tops. As I mentioned at the beginning, winter really is the best time to go in terms of the minimal crowds and the comfortable weather. On the other hand, in terms of food and accommodation, it didn't look like there was much open on site or in the nearby village. So you might have to pack a lunch or stop along the way if you're going at this time of year. However, given the number of sites in just the Argolid alone, I recommend actually not making this a day trip, but if you can swing it, spend a night or two in the region. There's plenty to see. But one site that you might miss if you're just kind of looking at a map is the nearby Archaeological bridge. Now, this is a Mycenaean era bridge that can still bear the weight of a car. It's the oldest bridge in Europe at 3,200 to 3,300 years old. Take that, Tower Bridge. And in my mind, with all the other things to see, like Epidavros, the theater, and Argos, why schlep back all the way to Athens? I'd really recommend basing yourself for a night or two at Nafplion. This is known to be Greece's most romantic city, and having seen a lot of cities in Greece, at least from my standpoint, that was true. It has a beautiful coastal walk and an amazing Venetian-era fort that you can climb up to. It's got great restaurants, nice boutique shopping, and some small but interesting museums of its own. Now, in all of Greece, my favorite store that I visited was called Agnithis. I probably butchered that pronunciation. But anyway, a mother-daughter team there weaves silk creations out of a traditional loom. Very nice stuff they deliver. I definitely recommend a visit there. So, while I would certainly urge you to visit the Argolid and the Peloponnesian Peninsula, as a standalone, the archaeological site of ancient Mycenae is a 3.5 out of 5 stars in my book. It's incredibly historically important. It's nearby but far away from the jostling crowds at the Parthenon, and it's very easily accessible to a slew of other sites. So if you're actively tracing this period in Greek history and you're doing a tour of the Peloponnesian, the site is not to be missed. But if you're kind of doing a quick hits of the most Instagrammable sites in Greece, definitely not the way I roll, but to each his or her own, I'd actually give it a skip.
Broadcasting live from somewhere underneath the ground. Archaeology News. The news you can trust.
All right, so for our first news story, we are going out of this world. And I have to admit, this isn't exactly a news story. You see, this popped up in my news feed for a few weeks. I think it came up first in early February, and I pretty much ignored it because I thought it was one of those weird alien archaeology things. But no, this is a legit news story. Archaeology news from outer space. All right, so we're going off to Villena, Spain. And this is actually not very far from Alicante, where we covered that cave archaeology drone story a couple months back. So in this region, a pretty impressive hoard of mostly silver and gold objects, 66, I believe to be exact, were found in the 1960s. Now, they dated from the late Bronze Age, which in Iberia was 1400 to 1200 BC. And, that's pretty cool. That's a pretty impressive stash of cash there. Lots of gold and silver, very, very shiny. But, to be honest, it wasn't really mind explosively mind-blowing. Because, as Bronze Age hoards in Europe go, that was an impressive haul. But this isn't one of those stories that's going to rewrite history. But here's the kicker. Among the stash, there were some objects found with iron in them. So, for example, you see this small hemisphere, probably on the pommel of a weapon or a staff, and that's the iron worked in there amongst the gold. You also see this bracelet made of iron, and, these in a stash of shinier things don't stand out that much. But what's the problem here? Well, this was the Bronze Age, meaning the people here didn't yet know about the smelting of iron. So where did this iron come from? Well, it turns out it came from outer space, from a meteorite to be exact. And how do we know this? Well, recently an international team of researchers decided to subject a sample to what's called mass spectrometry. And we've actually discussed this already in a few news cycles back regarding those early medieval ivory rings found in England. Now, just to refresh your memory, mass spectrometry works by identifying the isotopic composition of a molecule by measuring the mass to charge ratio, which will reveal the molecular structure. Now, what they found in this case is that the nickel content of the iron in these objects from the hoard was very, very high, much higher than it would be for iron that came from the Earth, and basically in line with iron that comes from a meteorite, which tends to have a much higher nickel content. Believe it or not, this is not nearly the first time this has happened. Just last year, researchers determined that the iron in some arrowheads found in Switzerland also came from a meteorite. Now, that one came from probably a few hundred years after the Villena hoard came about. And it's been about 10 years since researchers determined that this dagger from the burial of King Tut, Tutankhamun, also came from outer space. He was born in 1341 BC, which falls right in line with the dating of this hoard. I like this story for two reasons. First, it shows that even thousands of years ago, our distant ancestors had the same kind of curiosity and ingenuity that even the most far-out Silicon Valley gurus have today. They found something useful, realized it had important qualities, and figured out how to put them to use. It's that sense of discovery that we still possess today. And as I'm always saying, it sort of rehumanizes those distant people that we feel like we have very little in common with. They were adventurers, and you could even say early scientists and discoverers who made scientific discoveries and incorporated those into the things they made, including art. And just like us, they valued beauty, even though their lives were much more difficult and less leisured than ours are. Now, this is a weird analogy, but bear with me. This reminds me of a visit I made to Angkor Wat in Cambodia, which I will definitely have to do a site visit to sometime soon, so look out for that. But anyway, if you know where to look, in these temples built in the 12th century, you can actually find dinosaurs incorporated into the motifs. So does that mean this site was built by ancient aliens? No. It means these very, very ancient people, almost 1,000 years old at this point, must have dug up dinosaurs and recognized them to be something very old and special, and just like our paleontologists today, wanted to show them off. And the second reason I like this story, it shows that you can be an archaeologist and make breakthroughs without even digging anything, actually. Remember, this hoard was found in the 1960s, so about 60 years ago. And the issue is, museum archives are so overflowing with stuff. A lot of it is very under-researched or even unresearched. It's just sitting there, holding its secrets in. And that's actually a bit of a problem. Well, it's actually a big problem. Museum archives are absolutely bursting at the seams. In this country, the UK, the situation has kind of reached a crisis point. There's so much stuff overflowing museum archives that people don't know where it came from. They often don't know if it's real or it's fake. And there's not even enough people and resources to ensure its proper care. I guess this is how, there were all those objects, valuable objects in the British Museum archives that went missing, stolen, and sold off years before anyone even noticed. Now, how did this happen if these items were so valuable? And if they're so valuable, how come they weren't on display or being researched? The answer, money and personnel, and the lack of both. Now, how do we solve this? That is another story. And that actually segues very nicely into my second story, which takes us to...
In fair Verona, where we lay our scene.
Yes, that would be Verona, Italy, home of Juliet and her Romeo. And it turns out that Dr. Federica Gigante of Cambridge University was literally just by chance perusing the website of a local museum in Verona called the Fondazione Museo Miniscanchi Rezo and happened to notice this astrolabe. And if you don't know what an astrolabe or astrolabe, potato is, it's an instrument that was developed in ancient Greece, I think in the 2nd or 3rd century BC, used to identify objects in the sky and do all sorts of celestial calculations. It was essentially the precursor of the sextant, which came around in the 18th century and was a very useful navigational tool. Well, it piqued Dr. Gigante's interest, and it turns out the museum, when she asked, didn't really know much about the object, hadn't really researched it, and suspected that it might be a fake. So I think you're seeing the continuous theme here. Well, luckily, the museum was founded on the collection of a very long-standing noble family in the region who had a lot of documentation for the stuff in their collections. And it turns out that some 17th century ancestor, so a noble person in Verona, collected all of these things and cataloged them as a hobby and took copious notes. And it turned out that his notes perfectly reflected an early treatise written on astrolabes by a Jewish rabbi and polymath who lived in Verona in the 12th century. But that polymath was originally from Spain. Now, Verona in the medieval times was home to one of Europe's most significant and extensive Jewish populations. And these folks, because of the Jewish diaspora, had connections all around the Mediterranean. And what also made sense is that the astrolabe, which looked to be Spanish in styling, had Arabic and Hebrew written both on it. Now, why would that make sense? Because at the time, the 12th century, Spain was ruled by the Muslims, or the Moors they were called, and that was up until 1492 when Isabella and Ferdinand reunified Spain. And under the Muslims, Spain was a much more tolerant place than the rest of medieval Europe, where Jews and Muslims and Christians actually lived side by side in harmony. So medieval Spain saw a great intellectual and cultural flowering of the Jewish people there, who were able to live in peace. Unfortunately, this all ended when Ferdinand and Isabella instituted the Spanish Inquisition.
The Inquisition! Let's begin the Inquisition! Look out, see.
After that, Muslim and Jew alike were driven from Spain, killed, or forced to convert. But this object, the Astrolabe, contains the legacy of a more harmonious time for all of the people. Now, how does it do that? Well, it has Arabic inscriptions on it, some for the latitude of different cities in Spain, like Cordoba and Toledo. It has a bit of an Islamic prayer verse just carved into it. But there's also Hebrew inscriptions as well, the latitudes of other cities in Spain, as well as translated Arabic names, so translated into Hebrew from Arabic, of signs of the zodiac. However, something particularly interesting is another Arabic inscription, which says, for Ishaq, the work of Yunus. And that's significant because those names, Ishaq and Yunus, translate into English as Isaac and Jonah, and those are very common Jewish names. So these very likely could have been Sephardic or Spanish Jews who in that time were likely to have been conversant and literate in Arabic. And how would that have gotten then from Spain, from the Sephardic Jews, all the way to Italy, where the Jews are known as Ibraki? Well, that's not difficult to imagine. Like I just said, at this time, there was a very vibrant Jewish diaspora all over North Africa and the Mediterranean. Anyway, in these difficult times right now, this Astrolabe is insight into a more peaceful past and hopefully a one day more peaceful future. And from the archaeological point of view, it just highlights the problem again of all of those museum archives overflowing with understudied stuff. And quite frankly, if you're out there and you're considering a career in archaeology, even if you hate digging and don't want to get dirty, archaeology wants you. Now, finally, I want to finish off with a story about Çatalhöyük, also affectionately known as Çatalhöyük, Çatal What Now, and Çatal Bang Bang. If you don't know about Çatalhöyük, it is the motherlode of archaeological sites, and it is so big and so complex that I'm just going to scrape the very, very basics right now. I haven't been there yet, but when I do go, I'm going to have to do an extended edition, like 3-part series of my site review. But anyway, Çatalhöyük is in the middle of Turkey, and it is crazy. It's probably the oldest dense urban site in the whole world, putting it right at the borderline between the hunter-gatherer lifestyle and settled farming. So this is the early Neolithic period. Now, how old is that? That's almost 10,000 years old. This site flourished for about 1,000 years, starting at 7,500 BC. And there's so many bizarre things about it, but basically what it was a giant apartment building where about 8,000 people lived at any one time. The residents would constantly strip down the walls of their apartments as they got dirty with the smoke, repaint and replaster them, and after a generation or a few generations, they would build another apartment right on top of the old one. And during those times when they were renovating or building a new apartment, they might take little bits and pieces of dead people like grandma and put them in the walls or the floor. Then when they were renovating and, building a new apartment, they would move those around. And so there was this constant process of building new apartment units, one on top of the other. And just like the people at Knossos, bullhorns were probably their favorite decorative accent. How do you like that, HGTV? And perhaps the weirdest element of their daily life was these apartments had no doors. They were only accessible via ladders from openings in the ceiling. So living there, you got quite a workout and definitely not handicapped accessible. Anyway, the site has been excavated a few times, most recently as part of a massive project led by Ian Hodder, who we've met a few times already. And this project was massive. It went on for literally decades, from 1993 all the way to 2018. And this has to be one of the most prolific archaeological projects of all time, if not the most. They publish stuff every year. They're still publishing stuff every year, and that is likely to continue for many years to come. So what's the latest one? Well, in an area that was excavated where there was an oven, they actually found a piece of bread. Now, how old is that? Well, It's organic, obviously, so it was radiocarbon dated, and it was determined to be from approximately 6600 BC. That is over 8,600 years old. Who even knew they had bread back then? And even though it's the oldest piece of bread ever found, it was still spongy in texture when they found it. So likely a nicer texture than your local supermarket's croissants, unless, of course, you live in France. It was so well preserved thanks to being covered by a clay residue, which must have essentially created an anaerobic environment perfect for preservation. And also around this oven area were pea seeds, wheat, and barley. So these people ate well, but no low-carb Atkins diet for them, that's for sure. Whoa, archaeology never ceases to amaze me, but Çatalhöyük is just next level. I've got to make it there. Hey, if you like what you heard, give me that thumbs up below, hit that bell to subscribe, or if you want to support more independent archaeology content, consider contributing to my Patreon, where you can enjoy some exclusive members-only benefits and other goodies. Until the next dig.